What does it take to be erased from royalty? A scandal? A war? Or just marrying the wrong person? In the gilded world of crowns and courtiers, not all royal stories end in glory. Some end in quiet exile, cold legal clauses, and names scraped from palace walls. This is the untold history of 25 British royals who were stripped, sidelined, or silently erased from the royal record. Not every throne is lost in battle. Some are surrendered in whispers. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing a royal can do is try to live like a human being. Before we dive in, if you love stories that peel back the polished surface of history, make sure to subscribe for more forgotten chapters just like this one. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? Let's see how far this royal rabbit hole travels. 1. Edward VIII. History doesn't always whisper before it shouts. Sometimes it begins in a carefully polished drawing room with a cigarette smoldering in a silver tray, while the King of England stares out a frosted window and quietly prepares to destroy his own crown. In 1936, Edward VIII became the first British monarch in history to voluntarily step down from the throne. But to call it a love story is like calling the Titanic a boating mishap. It wasn't just about a woman. It was about choosing scandal over ceremony, desire over dynasty, and privacy over power. He didn't simply abdicate, he detonated the monarchy's public image. Edward was never meant to be a footnote. He was charismatic, stylish, and unusually modern for a man raised in rooms where people didn't look the king in the eye unless told. But he wasn't suited for the role the way his father, George V, had been, and the monarchy knew it. Courtiers winced at his disregard for protocol, his love for American slang, his preference for jazz over duty, and most of all, his troubling infatuation with Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite whose presence was radioactive in 1930s Britain. The government panicked. Wallis was not just unsuitable. She was toxic. Divorce was scandal enough. An American divorcee with a living ex-husband was political suicide. And so when Edward made it clear he would marry her or leave the throne, the British establishment didn't hesitate. They let him go. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII addressed the nation and, with a cigarette's ash threatening to fall, calmly explained he could not carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the woman he loved. It was the first time the British public heard a king speak to them directly over the radio, and the last time they would hear him as king. The very next day, he was demoted, not just in spirit, but in title. From His Majesty the King, Edward was recast as His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor, a courtesy title wrapped in silk but laced with salt. He was effectively banished, first to Austria, then to France, and finally to a strange diplomatic no-man's land where he was too royal to be ignored, but too controversial to be welcomed home. Edward's new identity was one of ceremonial exile. He was still a royal by blood, but a civilian by structure. He was denied military commands, royal duties, and worst of all, significance. During World War II, the British government didn't trust him enough to leave him in Europe. They sent him off to govern the Bahamas, as if that would keep his politics and his opinions off the main stage. There were rumors that he had sympathies with fascist regimes, that Wallis had affairs with Nazi officials, that his abdication wasn't just about romance, but about the kind of king he might have become. None of this was ever proven, but none of it ever fully disappeared. Edward never got back what he gave up. Wallis never became a queen. The crown passed to his younger brother, George VI, who never wanted it but wore it well. And Edward spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity, sipping cocktails in Paris, giving interviews, writing memoirs, and watching a world he might have ruled forget him by degrees. But the monarchy never forgave him. Not really. When he died in 1972, the funeral was quiet. The Queen allowed him to be buried at Frogmore, But there was no grand procession, no outpouring of state grief. Just the quiet closure of a door that had been left half open for too long. In the end, Edward VIII wasn't just removed from power. He was stripped of relevance. His titles became reminders of what he once was and never would be again. The cost of loving freely, in his case, was to live in permanent parentheses, a man who was king, briefly, until love made him something far more unimportant. But exile is rarely a solitary sport, and Edward wouldn't be the last royal to fall from favor under the weight of personal choices. In fact, the next royal didn't abdicate at all. He was pulled off the public stage kicking, screaming, and still holding on to his titles, until the headlines made that impossible. 2. Prince Andrew, Duke of York. It's hard to say exactly when Prince Andrew fell. That's the thing about slow-motion disasters. They don't begin with a bang, but with an expensive dinner, a tight smile, and a creeping sense that the walls are inching inward. For decades, Prince Andrew was known as the Queen's favorite, the action prince, the Falklands War hero, the dashing second son who didn't have to carry the burden of the crown and seemed to enjoy every inch of that freedom. And for a while, the charm worked. He flew helicopters, dated models, and did the kind of things that tabloid editors dream of. He was royalty without responsibility, a bachelor with a uniform, and for the royal PR machine, a reliable splash of color. But then the headlines began to shift. They got darker, stickier, less about polo and more about parties, less about his royal engagements and more about his increasingly questionable friendships. The turning point was Jeffrey Epstein, a name that became an ink stain on everyone associated with it. And Prince Andrew, somehow, was more than associated. He was entrenched. Photos emerged. A now infamous image of Andrew standing awkwardly with a teenage girl wrapped around his waist, the hollow kind of smile that seems carved rather than felt. There were questions, too many to ignore. Allegations spiraled into lawsuits. Accusations became sworn testimony. And through it all, Prince Andrew's denials got more emphatic and less convincing. Then came that interview. November 2019, BBC's Newsnight. In a bid to clear his name, Prince Andrew sat down with journalist Emily Maitlis and delivered what is arguably the most catastrophic interview ever given by a member of the royal family. He didn't sweat, he said, because of a rare medical condition. He couldn't have been with the girl in question because he remembered taking his daughter to a Pizza Express in Woking that night, a detail so oddly specific it landed with all the credibility of a Shakespearean aside. The public didn't buy it. Neither did the monarchy. By early 2022, Buckingham Palace had seen enough. After a civil lawsuit was filed against Andrew in the U.S., the Queen, yes, his own mother, stripped him of his royal patronages, military affiliations, and most significantly, his Royal Highness style. He could still technically call himself the Duke of York, but that title now felt less noble and more like a legal technicality. He was functionally no longer a working royal, a prince in name only. No more ceremonial parades, no more public appearances on the Queen's behalf. He was disinvited from nearly every official event and discreetly removed from balcony photos during Platinum Jubilee celebrations. And yet, unlike Edward VIII, Andrew didn't choose exile. He didn't go quietly. He stayed. A ghost of royal privilege drifting through Windsor, visible mostly when someone noticed the silence around him. He settled the lawsuit in 2022 out of court, with no admission of guilt, just an unspoken agreement to disappear. Public forgiveness was not extended. Private redemption, if it came at all, was deeply buried beneath decades of scandal, secrecy, and an institutional allergy to accountability. And so, Prince Andrew exists now in a kind of royal purgatory. He hasn't been officially disowned, but no one is sending him invitations either. His portrait doesn't hang in public view. His name is conspicuously absent from press releases. The military regiments he once represented have ceremonially replaced him with figures the public can applaud without wincing. He remains the Duke of York, but the title rings hollow. more like a warning than an honor, a symbol of how far a royal can fall, not from power, but from grace, that intangible thing no crown can guarantee. The monarchy didn't just strip him of titles. It sealed him in a glass box, labeled not to be opened in public, and slid it under the rug. But at least Andrew was born royal. He started with everything and lost it inch by inch. Not all royals begin that way. Some are born with foreign blood, tangled in complex allegiances, and find themselves erased not by scandal but by war. Before we get to the next royal lost to war in lineage, take a second to subscribe. It helps keep these stories alive and unpolished. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it on your end? Are you deep into a 3 a.m. mystery spiral or sneaking this in on your lunch break? Let's map the monarchy's reach. 3. Prince Henry of Prussia. Long before Twitter could cancel you, a royal could be erased with the stroke of a fountain pen in the full force of Parliament. Prince Henry of Prussia learned this the hard way, not for scandal, not for sedition, but for bloodlines and battlefield loyalties that were suddenly on the wrong side of history. He wasn't just a Prussian prince. He was married to Princess Irene of Hesse, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. That made him, by marriage, part of the extended British royal family, a status that once came with invitations to state dinners, inclusion in royal correspondence, and the occasional sentimental portrait in the family gallery. It was the kind of soft diplomacy the monarchs of Europe had practiced for centuries. Marry your cousins, smile for the cameras, and quietly hope they don't declare war on each other. But World War I ruined that illusion. In 1914, the world fell apart in slow motion, and suddenly the crown had to choose between sentiment and sovereignty. German royals with British titles, a common occurrence thanks to Queen Victoria's sprawling lineage, became a liability. Prince Henry wasn't a fringe relative. He was a prominent figure in the German Empire, the brother of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and an admiral in the German Navy. When Britain declared war on Germany, Henry wasn't just on the wrong team. He was wearing its uniform. He fought for Germany, actively. And no matter how many times Queen Victoria had cooed over baby Henry in the past, there was no room for nuance once the bombs started falling on London. In 1917, the British government passed the Titles Deprivation Act, a cold, bureaucratic tool designed to surgically remove disloyal royals from the family tree. Henry was one of the first names on the list. With Parliament's blessing, King George V officially stripped him of all British styles, honors, and titles. Whatever English grandeur had once been attached to his name evaporated with a quiet legal clause. From that point on, Prince Henry of Prussia was no longer a British royal in any meaningful way. He didn't lose a crown. He lost recognition. His name vanished from the court circular. He became a familial ghost, unmentioned in polite company and politely excised from the narrative of noble continuity. What made Henry's removal sting even more was its symbolism. He wasn't caught in a scandal. He didn't commit a personal failing. He simply happened to be born on one side of a family tree that was now at war with the other. The same blood that once bound the European monarchies together now marked him for exclusion. His wife, Princess Irene, remained a strange bridge between both worlds. British by birth, German by marriage, and privately devastated by the war's ability to turn cousins into enemies. She kept close ties with her sisters, including the Tsarina of Russia and Queen Victoria Eugenie of Spain, both of whom would also witness their worlds unravel in the coming years. It was a tragic constellation of royals brought down not by choice but by the collapsing structure of the old world. Prince Henry lived the rest of his life in Germany, far from the pageantry of Buckingham Palace or the titles he once held by marriage. He died in 1940, as Europe once again teetered into war, and this time no one suggested restoring his titles. His name was a relic, too German for Britain, too royal for the republics rising in his homeland. But the war didn't just claim Henry. The Titles Deprivation Act had a longer list. It worked its way down the family tree, pruning anyone who had fought for the Reich, no matter how regal their heritage. And next in its path was another royal who, like Henry, found himself stripped not for what he did, but for where he came from, and which flag he saluted when the world split in two. 4. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Brunswick. It's never easy being royalty in two countries, especially when those countries declare war on each other. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Brunswick, discovered this the hard way, and unlike those who faded quietly from royal view, Ernest was removed with surgical precision. An example of what happens when royal bloodlines turn into diplomatic liabilities. Ernest Augustus wasn't some distant cousin barely hanging on to a courtesy title. He was a great-grandson of King George III and, by all legal definitions, a British royal prince. But he was also a direct heir to the Kingdom of Hanover, a now-defunct German realm that had once shared a monarch with Britain until the crown was split by the inconvenient matter of Salic law. That legal quirk barred women from ruling Hanover, which meant when Queen Victoria took the throne in Britain, the Hanoverian kingship passed to her uncle. From that point onward, the British and Hanoverian royal lines diverged, at least on paper. By the time Ernest Augustus came along in the late 19th century, he was positioned as both Duke of Brunswick and head of the House of Hanover. That meant, to Britain, he was one of theirs. But to Germany, he was one of their own. This royal overlap might have been charming in the age of handwritten letters and shared Christmas trees, but by 1914, it was nothing short of a geopolitical disaster. When World War I broke out, Ernest Augustus sided with Germany. It wasn't a betrayal, at least not by his logic. He was a German duke, living in a German duchy, serving the German cause. But to Britain, this wasn't just a case of unfortunate allegiance. It was treason adjacent. And as the war dragged on, the tolerance for dual loyalties evaporated. The monarchy was shedding its Germanic identity as fast as it could, renaming the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor, anglicizing titles, and scrubbing away anything that might suggest a sympathetic link to the Kaiser's empire. In 1917, King George V authorized the Titles Deprivation Act, a blunt instrument dressed in parliamentary robes. Ernest Augustus was one of the most prominent targets. His British titles, peerages, and honors were formally stripped. Gone was his status as a prince of the United Kingdom. Gone were his rights to sit in the House of Lords. What remained was a legal carcass, still a royal in Germany, but persona non grata in the country where his great-grandfather had once ruled. The irony? He was married to Princess Victoria Louise, the only daughter of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and their 1913 wedding had been one of the last great royal family reunions before the continent fractured. King George V, Tsar Nicholas II, and the Kaiser himself all in attendance, dressed in splendid uniforms, raising glasses in celebration of familial unity that would dissolve within a year. That marriage, once seen as a dynastic triumph, was now retroactively viewed as a liability. Ernest Augustus lost more than his titles. He lost access to the British royal network, diplomatic standing, and the symbolic privilege that came with being recognized as part of the British establishment. His children, too, were effectively removed from the line of succession, not by blood, but by legal exile. Despite everything, he remained active in German public life. He continued his role in German aristocracy through the Weimar Republic and even into the Nazi era, where his family's position remained ambiguous, influential enough to be noticed, but cautious enough to avoid direct political entanglement. Still, in Britain, his name was reduced to a footnote in the larger project of wartime purification. And like a pattern repeating itself with tragic familiarity, Ernest wasn't alone. His story was just one tile in a larger mosaic, a monarchic bloodline pulled in two directions by geography and war. The Titles Deprivation Act would go on to erase several more names from Britain's royal registry, each one a quiet revocation, a formal forgetting. The next on that list? Another grandson of Queen Victoria, one who, like Ernest, inherited both prestige and peril from a divided ancestry, and who, once war came, found that titles are only safe when the flags they stand under are still flying in the same direction. 5. Prince Charles Edward, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Some royals are born into scandal, others chase it. But Prince Charles Edward, Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was born into something far more complicated, a name that carried two empires and eventually satisfied neither. He was Queen Victoria's grandson. That alone should have been enough to guarantee a life of privilege, pomp, and respectable irrelevance. The kind of British royal who wears too many medals and opens too many hospitals. But fate, or at least dynastic chess, had other plans. At the tender age of 16, Charles Edward was plucked from his studies at Eton and shipped off to Germany to become the ruler of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a minor but respected duchy in the German Empire. This was not a promotion. It was an export. Germany needed a duke. Britain had a spare royal. And so, with a faintly diplomatic shrug, Charles Edward became Karl Eduard, the latest Anglo-German hybrid in a long line of them. He embraced the role with the enthusiasm of someone who didn't yet understand the cost. He learned German, donned the uniforms, and pledged loyalty to the Kaiser. And in doing so, he walked directly into the storm that would one day erase his British titles entirely. World War I made things simple for people with complicated loyalties. It drew a line, and you had to pick a side. Charles Edward chose Germany, and not just passively. He served in the German army, took up causes aligned with imperial interests, and became a fervent supporter of the German war effort. To his British relatives, this was more than uncomfortable. It was untenable. King George V, who had once attended Charles Edward's christening, now had to reckon with the fact that his cousin was, for all intents and purposes, a wartime enemy. And so, in 1917, with the Titles Deprivation Act freshly inked and ready for surgical application, Charles Edward's name was among the first to be struck. His British titles, Duke of Albany, Earl of Clarence, and Baron Arklow, were formally stripped. His membership in the Order of the Garter? Revoked. His status as a British royal? Dismantled. It wasn't just a legal measure. It was a political cleansing. Britain was purging itself of German influence, and Charles Edward had become a cautionary tale. The once celebrated grandson of Victoria was now a foreign noble, repackaged in history as a reminder of how fragile royal loyalty could be. But his story didn't stop with the war. If anything, it got more complicated. In post-war Germany, Charles Edward struggled to adapt. The monarchy had been abolished. His duchy no longer existed in any sovereign sense. But like many former royals, he clung to influence where he could find it. He moved in nationalist circles, sought relevance through political alignment, and eventually, perhaps inevitably, drifted into dangerous ideological waters during the rise of Nazism. He became a supporter of the Nazi Party. He joined organizations aligned with Hitler's vision for Germany. He served as president of the German Red Cross, a position that carried more political weight than humanitarian one during that era. And he became, in the eyes of his British family, not just a former royal, but an embarrassment of diplomatic proportions. After World War II, the Allies arrested him. He was interned, investigated, and declared a lesser offender by a denazification court. But his reputation never recovered. His British titles, already lost decades earlier, were never even considered for restoration. The monarchy had long since buried his name beneath the polite silence of distance. He died in 1954, not as a Prince of Britain, but as a discarded symbol of a broken empire and a fractured family. His story, like many of the royals lost to the Titles Deprivation Act, reveals something uncomfortable: that titles, no matter how gilded, are paper shields against the choices that history forces you to make. And speaking of divided loyalties, the act didn't stop with Charles Edward. It kept going, cutting down branches of the family tree that had grown too deep into enemy soil. The next name on the list? A royal tied not only to Britain's monarchy, but to the military aristocracy of a rising empire, and one whose demotion came not with scandal, but with war's brutal arithmetic. 6. Prince Wilhelm of Prussia. Prince Wilhelm of Prussia didn't just lose his British titles. He lost his position in a royal family that had, until the world unraveled, seen itself as a pan-European insurance policy. Marry your cousins, secure your alliances, keep the throne in the family. It was an elegant system, right up until the moment it exploded. Wilhelm was born into a world where being both British and German wasn't a contradiction. It was practically fashionable. His grandmother, Victoria, Princess Royal, was the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria and had married the future German Emperor Frederick III. Their children, including Wilhelm, grew up straddling two of Europe's most powerful dynasties, the House of Hohenzollern and the House of Hanover-Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, names that sound like symphonies but fell like dominoes. Wilhelm wasn't just a royal heir. He was the future, a Prussian prince raised with the expectation of influence, power, and military glory. But when the First World War erupted, those family ties across Europe became liabilities, not assets. Suddenly, the polite fiction of international royalty collapsed into the brutal clarity of national allegiance. Prince Wilhelm, unsurprisingly, served in the German army. He was a Hohenzollern, after all, the ruling dynasty of the German Empire. Fighting for Germany wasn't a betrayal from his point of view. It was his duty. But from Britain's point of view, it was treason adjacent. One more example of how entangled and dangerous the royal bloodlines had become. By 1917, Britain was hemorrhaging patience. Anti-German sentiment was boiling over at home. The royal family's own name was changed from the very German Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the aggressively plain Windsor. And King George V, who had once attended royal weddings with Wilhelm, now faced a stark political choice: protect the monarchy or protect the family. He couldn't do both. Enter the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917, a law that didn't shout but rather whispered its intent through legalese: remove the German-linked royals, cleanse the institution of foreign influence, and erase from public record those who had chosen the wrong side of history. Wilhelm's name was one of several added to the list. His British honors and princely status were revoked. No ceremony, no rebuttal, just a quiet bureaucratic decapitation. For Wilhelm, the consequences were more symbolic than practical. He hadn't grown up in Britain. His identity was firmly German, and he had little use for the British titles aside from the diplomatic glitter they once offered. But what stung, what always stings in these cases, was the rejection. To be removed by your grandmother's country, by your mother's kin, was not just a loss of status. It was a statement of disownment. Wilhelm's life after the war was marked by a slow fade into aristocratic irrelevance. The German monarchy was dismantled after 1918, and the Hohenzollerns became a royal family in name only. Wilhelm, like many former royals, struggled to find a role in the modern world. Too noble for normalcy, too politically toxic for public life. He died in 1951, largely forgotten outside of royal historian circles. His British titles were never restored. The nation that had once considered him one of its own had quietly deleted his chapter. His story, like those of the other royals cut down by the Titles Deprivation Act, is less about personal failure and more about the brutal efficiency of war. In peacetime, these princes were symbols of unity. In wartime, they were risks. And when risk outweighs sentiment, the crown sharpens its scissors. But while war made these decisions easy for governments, the human cost was far messier. Because not every royal stripped of their title was fighting for the other side. Some were fighting for love, others for dignity. And one in particular, a princess raised in privilege, who gave up everything for a man with no crown, proved that even voluntary exits could come with a permanent erasure. 7. Princess Patricia of Connaught. Royalty is often a performance, and Princess Patricia of Connaught played the part with a sort of quiet brilliance. Born in 1886 to Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught and Strathearn, the third son of Queen Victoria, Patricia was never meant to inherit a throne, but she was born with the full ceremonial weight of a princess. Her life unfolded in palaces, at state banquets, beside carriages drawn by ceremonial horses. She was royalty to the bone, with all the unspoken expectations that came with it. And then she walked away from it. Not in scandal, not in protest, but in what might be the most dignified, deliberate act of royal self-erasure in the entire canon of British aristocracy. In 1919, Patricia voluntarily gave up her royal title upon marrying a commoner, Alexander Ramsay, a naval officer and her father's aide-de-camp. The decision was historic. She didn't lose her title because of war or scandal. She gave it away. And that made the silence afterward all the louder. At the time, Patricia was considered one of the most eligible royal women in Europe. She was beautiful, highly educated, deeply connected across royal households, and had suitors from several royal families on the continent, including the future King Alfonso XIII of Spain. But Patricia, unlike her more strategically inclined relatives, didn't treat marriage as a dynastic maneuver. She followed something less practical: affection. Alexander Ramsay wasn't a prince. He had no title, no land, no claim to any throne. He was competent, decorated, and respected. But in royal terms, he was furniture, not a fixture. And yet Patricia chose him over the entire infrastructure of royal matchmaking. The monarchy, to its credit, didn't stop her, but it made sure she understood the consequences. At her wedding, Patricia gave up the style of Her Royal Highness and the title of Princess of Great Britain and Ireland. From that moment onward, she was known simply as Lady Patricia Ramsay. The title sounds delicate, almost affectionate, but in royal taxonomy it marked a steep descent. She retained a certain social prestige, of course, but it was clear she was no longer a working royal. Her name slipped from royal communications. Her place in the order of precedence dropped. The palace balcony suddenly had one fewer silhouette. Unlike the wartime exiles of her German cousins, Patricia's removal was domestically acceptable, even romantic. But it was still a removal. She didn't return to official royal life. She didn't carry out engagements on behalf of the crown. She became, in effect, a private citizen with memories of a public life. Yet Patricia remained oddly loyal to the institution that had quietly distanced itself from her. During World War II, she volunteered with the British Red Cross and continued to appear occasionally at royal events, albeit without the formality and fanfare that had once accompanied her every move. She lived quietly at the Ramsay family estate and raised her only child, Alexander Ramsay of Mar, outside of the traditional royal spotlight. In many ways, Patricia lived the life other royals claimed to want, one of normalcy, love, and personal freedom. But the price was total demotion. No drama, no scandal, just absence. Her portrait faded from royal galleries. Her name became a footnote. The monarchy moved on. And yet, her decision carved out a strange legacy, one that haunted future generations of royals who might also consider stepping away. Because Patricia's story proves something that no courtier ever says aloud. Once you leave the gilded cage, no one leaves the door open behind you. Her quiet exit was not the last. In fact, her voluntary removal paved the way, unintentionally, for others to do the same. Not every departure would be so calm. Not every surrender so elegant. Some removals came not with marriage but with ancestry. And in 1917 the British royal family began the brutal work of cutting down its German branches. The next to fall? A royal woman whose only crime was being born with the wrong surname at the wrong time in the wrong empire. 8. Princess Alexandra of Cumberland. If royal blood is supposed to guarantee anything, it's survival through symbolism. But in 1917, symbolism itself became radioactive, and few felt this more sharply than Princess Alexandra of Cumberland, a royal whose very name became grounds for erasure. Born in 1882, Princess Alexandra was not some distant cousin tucked away in a dusty wing of a forgotten castle. She was the daughter of the Duke of Cumberland and Teviotdale, and granddaughter of King George V of Hanover, the offshoot German branch of the British royal family that had governed Hanover until it was annexed by Prussia in the 1860s. Her family still styled themselves as royals, still held titles under British law, and still received the ceremonial nods that came with those designations. By blood, Alexandra was part of the royal firm, but by war, she was on the wrong side. World War I didn't just redraw maps, it redrew family trees. When Britain went to war with Germany in 1914, everything German became suspect, and few things were more awkward than the fact that the British royal family, from Queen Victoria onward, was practically constructed out of Germanic dynasties. There were German princes with English titles, German dukes with seats in the House of Lords, German princesses married into the British peerage. And for a country trying to whip up patriotism during an existential war, this was a problem. So, in 1917, Parliament passed the Titles Deprivation Act, a law tailored to address the royal elephant in the room. It gave King George V the power to strip titles from any member of the British nobility who had borne arms against His Majesty or adhered to His Majesty's enemies during the war. It was a scalpel disguised as a statute. Princess Alexandra, by then married to Friedrich Franz IV, the Grand Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, found herself directly in its path. Her marriage had shifted her official status from British royal to German duchess, and her husband, like many nobles of his rank and station, had served in the German army. That was enough. Alexandra's name was quietly removed from the official roll of the British royal family. Her style as a British princess? Gone. Her rank within the ceremonial orders? Dissolved. She hadn't committed a crime. She hadn't spoken out against the British crown. But proximity was enough. She was royal and German, and in wartime Britain, those two facts were mutually exclusive. Her removal wasn't headline news, not in the way abdications or scandals would later be. There was no dramatic announcement, no public spectacle, just silence. A bureaucratic deletion. One day she was a princess of the United Kingdom. The next, she was not. Alexandra's life after the war was, by necessity, quiet. The German monarchy crumbled in 1918, and her husband abdicated like so many others in the cascading collapse of European empires. They retreated from political life, their titles, now ceremonial at best and symbolic at worst. She lived out her days in the shadows of former palaces, no longer a figure of diplomatic connection, but rather a relic of a royal world that no longer existed. She died in 1963, long after the last war had ended, long after the monarchy had reinvented itself as a symbol of British resilience and continuity. But her name was never reinstated on any royal list. Her titles were never restored. She remained, officially, a royal ghost, erased not by scandal, but by paperwork. And yet, in some strange way, her removal helped shape what the monarchy became. Her quiet erasure was part of a larger house cleaning, a symbolic severing of continental ties that helped the British monarchy redefine itself as purely British, even as its bloodline said otherwise. But not all removals were done by the crown. Sometimes it was the royal themselves who made the choice, willingly shedding titles to step into new identities. And one such man, born on foreign soil with a mouthful of dynastic names, would give up his titles not in shame, but in exchange for something far more enduring, a future with the woman who would become queen. 9. Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. Before he was the gruff consort trailing a few respectful paces behind Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark was a royal in limbo. Stateless, nameless, and deeply inconvenient to just about every throne he touched. He was born on a kitchen table in Corfu, exiled as a baby, raised in borrowed houses across Europe, and when he finally did get the girl, he had to give up everything to do it. His royal lineage was unimpeachable. He was a prince of both Greece and Denmark, descended from the Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg dynasty, which ruled more countries than most modern travelers could find on a map. He was also, perhaps more importantly, a great-great-grandchild of Queen Victoria, which meant that despite being born abroad, his DNA was unmistakably woven into the fabric of Britain's aristocracy. But by the time he reached adulthood, none of it mattered. His family had been deposed. His father was in self-imposed exile. His mother had been institutionalized. His sisters had married into German nobility, some of it with troubling ideological affiliations. So, when he began courting Princess Elizabeth in the 1940s, he wasn't bringing much to the table. Not in the way traditional royal alliances once demanded. No kingdom, no wealth, and no political leverage. Just a name full of countries that no longer wanted him, and a pair of impressively royal eyebrows. But love, or at least the royal version of it, prevailed. There was, however, a cost. Before he could marry the heir to the British throne, Philip had to renounce everything: his Greek and Danish titles, his place in foreign royal houses, and even his name. In March 1947, months before the wedding, he officially gave up his styles as Prince of Greece and Denmark. It was a legal severing, but also a cultural one. He ceased to exist, at least in the form that the European aristocracy had previously known him. To replace the loss, he took the surname Mountbatten, anglicized from the Battenberg family line, which itself had been scrubbed of its German identity during World War I. It was a name with royal ties, but stripped of any inconvenient nationalism. He was also granted the title Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, RN, and then, after some behind-the-scenes wrangling, made Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich on the morning of his wedding. But none of those came with the style of prince. That would have to wait. For nearly a decade after the wedding, Philip was not technically a prince of Britain. He was a duke, a consort, and a naval officer, but not a royal prince in the eyes of protocol. It wasn't until 1957, a full 10 years later, that Queen Elizabeth II formally granted him the title Prince of the United Kingdom. Even then, it wasn't automatic. It had to be proclaimed, a decision that sparked tension within the royal family and whispers among courtiers. Philip's identity, in many ways, was a collage assembled under pressure. Born as a prince, exiled as a child, scrubbed of his foreign titles as a suitor, then rebuilt as a domestic nobleman in the image of a modern monarchy. He spent the rest of his life walking that razor's edge, never quite forgetting what he had given up, and never quite allowed to forget where he came from. His renunciation wasn't born from scandal, but necessity. The monarchy needed to present a purified British-only image after 2 world wars had made German connections politically toxic. A foreign prince marrying the future queen could only work if he ceased to be foreign at all. And in this, Philip was a prototype, a man who surrendered one identity to be tolerated within another. He may have stood beside the throne, but only after casting off the fragments of the ones he'd left behind. But not every royal who lost their title got a dukedom in return. Some were erased quietly, without fanfare or recompense, their bloodlines too complicated, their associations too politically radioactive. And in the aftermath of war, even the most distant family ties to Germany were enough to sever centuries of royal recognition. The next story isn't about a person, but a group. Brothers born into a collapsing royal house, who were written out of British history with one swift bureaucratic stroke. 10. Princess Marina's brothers, Greek royal family. If royal blood once guaranteed immunity from politics, the 20th century crushed that illusion with a merciless efficiency. Nowhere is this more evident than in the fate of Princess Marina's brothers, the sons of Prince Nicholas of Greece and Denmark, whose royal identities were slowly unstitched, not through scandal or rebellion, but by the slow, cold unraveling of history itself. Princess Marina is remembered as the last foreign princess to marry into the British royal family. When she wed Prince George, Duke of Kent, in 1934, the union was celebrated as a rare continental alliance at a time when Europe was beginning to fracture along ideological lines. Marina brought style, pedigree, and a certain cosmopolitan flair to the British monarchy. Her lineage was impeccable. She was the granddaughter of King George III of Greece and a great-granddaughter of Tsar Alexander II of Russia. Her brothers, equally noble by birth, shared in that web of royal affiliations, but it turned out that being royal wasn't enough. Not anymore. Her brothers, Prince Paul, Prince George, and Prince Michael of Greece and Denmark, were born into a European dynasty that had once stretched from Copenhagen to Athens, their titles the result of a long-standing tradition of cross-continental royal matchmaking. They were technically princes of both Greece and Denmark, thanks to their descent from the House of Glucksburg. And under Queen Victoria's long reign, these titles would have opened every door in Europe, including those in Britain. But when the British Parliament began reassessing its royal affiliations during and after World War I, these continental connections became liabilities. In the aftermath of the war, King George V was under pressure to redefine the British monarchy as entirely British, not just in practice but in bloodline and symbolism. This meant severing ties with German-sounding dynasties, replacing foreign traditions with British substitutes, and most importantly, reviewing the legitimacy of foreign royals who had once held British status. Marina's brothers were among those whose affiliations were reevaluated under this climate. While not directly involved in the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917, they became symbolic casualties of the same impulse, a sweeping effort to untangle Britain's monarchy from Europe's increasingly volatile web of royal families. The Greek monarchy itself was notoriously unstable, swinging between constitutional monarchy and full-blown exile, and the British crown began treating its Greek cousins with caution. Any formal British recognition or inclusion was quietly withdrawn. These princes, once considered part of the extended royal family, were effectively removed from the inner royal circle. There was no public scandal, no formal announcement, just distance. Prince Paul would go on to become King of Greece in 1947, but even then, his ties to the British royal family remained ceremonial at best. His brothers, especially Prince George, who never married and lived most of his life in aristocratic obscurity, became historical footnotes. Prince Michael, the youngest, was born after the family had been exiled from Greece. He grew up moving between countries, fluent in multiple languages, but stateless in every sense that mattered. His British royal recognition was nominal, at best. In later life, he became a writer and historian, but his royal heritage was something he wore lightly and quietly. Marina's brothers were not formally stripped in a single parliamentary act. They were removed by omission. Their names disappeared from official British court records. They were no longer invited to state events. Their titles, once echoed in the halls of Windsor, faded from memory. The monarchy simply moved on, refocused inward, cleansed of foreign affiliations, and polished into something less European, more insular, more manageable. And yet, through Marina herself, a thread remained. She continued her life in Britain as a working royal, bearing the title Duchess of Kent, and raising her children in the royal fold. But the family she came from, the brothers who once walked beside her as royal equals, became strangers to the crown. Their erasure was not loud, but total. Still, not every title loss came by political distancing or wartime restructuring. Some were triggered by deeply personal choices, a decision to marry for love, to cross religious lines, to break silent taboos. And one such royal, a grandson of King George V himself, would find that even the quietest personal decision could carry enough weight to cost a place in the royal succession. 11. Prince Michael of Kent. Among the British royals quietly reshuffled into the margins, Prince Michael of Kent occupies a peculiar space. Not quite exiled, not quite embraced, and always just one step outside the warm, glittering circle of the firm. His story isn't about disgrace or defiance. It's about proximity. To power, to scandal, to rules both ancient and absurd, and how the simple act of choosing a partner can trigger centuries-old laws designed to prune the royal tree. Born in 1942, Prince Michael is the youngest child of Prince George, Duke of Kent, and Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. That makes him a first cousin to Queen Elizabeth II, and, for much of his life, a fixture of royal events, impeccably dressed, impeccably mannered, and impeccably positioned just far enough from the throne to enjoy the perks without the pressure. He attended royal weddings, served in the military, and performed ceremonial duties abroad, all with a public profile that hovered just above anonymity. And then, in 1978, he married Baroness Marie Christine von Reibnitz. This in itself was not controversial. She was elegant, educated, and well-connected, a woman of aristocratic background with a complex European pedigree. But she was also Roman Catholic, and in the arcane labyrinth of British succession law, that one detail changed everything. According to the 1701 Act of Settlement, a law passed during the reign of William III to ensure a Protestant succession, any royal who married a Catholic was automatically excluded from the line of succession. No ceremony, no appeal. Just a quiet bureaucratic guillotine. So, the moment Prince Michael married Marie Christine, he lost his place in the line to the throne. One day he was 15th in line. The next, he was nowhere. He also quietly stepped back from most public royal duties, though he retained his title and was never officially stripped of anything. His name simply stopped appearing on the succession roll, and yet his removal carried symbolic weight. This wasn't about his behavior or his politics. It was about religion, a centuries-old paranoia baked into the very DNA of British constitutional law. A reminder that, for all its modern rebranding, the monarchy still operated under rules that viewed Catholicism less as a faith and more as a foreign threat. For years, Prince Michael's exclusion was quietly tolerated, a relic of the system, just one of those things. But as the world modernized, the logic behind his removal began to feel absurd. By the early 2000s, polls showed that even the British public found the rule archaic. And in 2013, Parliament finally acted. The Succession to the Crown Act repealed the exclusion of royals married to Catholics, allowing them to retain their place in the line. And just like that, Prince Michael was restored. Sort of. He re-entered the line of succession, now far down the list, behind dozens of younger royals. But the reinstatement felt more like a formality than a comeback. By that point, he had already lived decades in quiet royal limbo. His military career was complete. His children were grown. His wife had converted to Anglicanism, and the royal world had evolved without him. Still, the episode left its mark. Prince Michael's temporary removal, though bloodless and bureaucratic, revealed the strange fragility of royal identity, how a name, a birthright, a place in history can hinge on a clause from a law written in the shadow of the Glorious Revolution. And even after his reinstatement, Prince Michael never quite rejoined the royal spotlight. His presence at royal events remained polite, ceremonial, and peripheral. In public perception, he existed on the monarchy's outer orbit, recognizable, respectable, but rarely discussed unless someone needed to name the Queen's cousin who looked suspiciously like Tsar Nicholas II. His story underscores a quiet truth, that royal status, even when unchallenged by scandal, can be disassembled by the slow-turning gears of law, religion, and tradition. Not with fanfare, but with footnotes. And yet, some royal removals were not matters of law or legacy, but decisions made across generations. Some families chose to step away from the British titles entirely, opting instead for integration into the royal structures of other nations. Because for certain descendants of British princesses, the question was not whether they would lose their British status, but whether they ever wanted it in the first place. 12. Princess Margaret of Connaught's descendants. Not all royal exits are dramatic. Some are quieter, woven into family decisions and diplomatic shifts that feel administrative on the surface, but carry the echo of generational consequences. The descendants of Princess Margaret of Connaught are a case study in that kind of slow, graceful unraveling, a gradual distancing from British titles that, while not explosive, remains irreversible. Born in 1882, Princess Margaret of Connaught was the daughter of Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, and granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was considered one of the brightest stars of her generation, beautiful, charming, multilingual, and thoroughly royal. Had history unfolded differently, she might have become Queen of Sweden. In fact, she almost did. In 1905, Margaret married Prince Gustav Adolf of Sweden, who would later become King Gustav VI Adolf. It was a strategic marriage in the old tradition, uniting the British and Swedish royal houses, strengthening diplomatic ties, and ensuring that the legacy of Queen Victoria would stretch even further across the map of Europe. The union was widely celebrated, a royal love story with enough mutual affection to soften the diplomatic edges. But marrying out of the country came with a price. Margaret, though still considered a British princess, became first and foremost a member of the Swedish royal family. Her identity, her residence, her duties, all shifted permanently to Stockholm. Her children, though royal by birth and heirs to the Swedish throne, were not raised as British royals. They inherited their father's dynastic legacy, not their mother's. Which brings us to the core of the mystery. Why were her descendants effectively removed from the British royal fold? The answer lies in a mix of law, choice, and practicality. When a British princess marries into a foreign royal house, her children do not automatically receive British titles or succession rights unless explicitly granted. This wasn't just custom, it was policy. Margaret's children were raised as Swedish royals, served in Swedish public life, and were never considered part of the British line of succession, despite their perfectly royal blood. There was no formal stripping, no scandalous departure. But over time, the connection frayed. British titles were not inherited. Honors were not extended. And by the next generation, Margaret's descendants were, for all intents and purposes, foreign royals with British ancestry, not British royals with Swedish affiliations. Some might argue that this wasn't removal at all, simply a natural progression of dynastic politics. But what makes the case notable is the voluntary aspect. Princess Margaret could have requested British titles for her children. The crown could have extended them. But neither side pushed for it. The message was clear. The future of this branch of the family tree lay elsewhere. Today, her descendants include some of the most senior members of the Swedish royal family, notably King Carl XVI Gustaf, her grandson, who sits on the throne of Sweden with little fanfare and a distinctly Nordic sense of understatement. His British ancestry is acknowledged, but functionally irrelevant. He holds no British titles. He performs no duties for the crown. And while he is occasionally invited to major royal events in Britain, it is as a foreign head of state, not as a family member returning home. It is perhaps the most polite form of royal erasure. No disgrace, no demotion, just distance. A family line that once sat near the heart of Queen Victoria's empire now orbits a different sun entirely. Yet the decision echoes through the royal halls to this day. It set a precedent that marrying into foreign royalty, however noble, can mean stepping away from Britain's royal machinery. That royal blood does not guarantee royal recognition. And that sometimes it is the quiet choices, the ones made in drawing rooms and private correspondences, that permanently alter the shape of a dynasty. The next royal didn't make that choice. He didn't slip away through marriage or migration. He was cut loose, not for anything he did wrong, but for the unfortunate fact that his uniform, once respected, became the enemy's. His story, like so many others in 1917, was less a scandal and more a strategic deletion. 13. Prince Ernest of Hohenlohe-Langenburg. In the grand tapestry of European royalty, some names fade not because they lack nobility, but because they carried the wrong name at the wrong moment. Prince Ernest of Hohenlohe-Langenburg was one such casualty, a man of noble heritage and royal ties whose British titles were cleanly erased, not by personal disgrace, but by geopolitical math. Born in 1863, Prince Ernest wasn't a fringe figure in the British royal orbit. He was married to Princess Alexandra of Edinburgh, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, making him part of the inner circle of European aristocracy. He was the head of the House of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, a small but significant German princely family. While his homeland wasn't a great power in the same sense as Prussia or Austria, Ernest had a well-established place among Germany's noble elite, and, crucially, close familial links to the British royal family. In the pre-war years, this dual identity was not just accepted, it was celebrated. European royals were constantly exchanging titles, attending weddings and toasting their mutual bloodlines with alarming efficiency. Ernest was no exception. He was a regular guest at British royal events, held honorary positions, and maintained all the trappings of a British-aligned continental prince. But then the world caught fire. When World War I erupted in 1914, the quiet luxury of dynastic diplomacy collapsed under the weight of nationalism. And by the time the war reached its darkest middle point, it was clear that having a German surname was no longer a quirk of royal genealogy. It was a liability. Ernest's situation was textbook. He was a German prince by blood, married into the British royal family, and loyal to the German Empire. During the war, he served in the German military, not as a frontline soldier, but as part of the aristocratic infrastructure that underpinned the German war effort. He wasn't leading cavalry charges across no man's land, but his loyalty was not in question. He was on Germany's side, and Britain knew it. This, unfortunately for him, aligned him directly in the crosshairs of the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917. Passed with surgical intent, the act authorized the British Crown to remove all titles, honors, and rights from any member of the British peerage or royal family who had borne arms against His Majesty or adhered to His Majesty's enemies during the war. Ernest checked both boxes, and so, without ceremony, his British honors were revoked. It wasn't just a bureaucratic maneuver, it was a public message. Britain was rewriting its royal affiliations, cutting out the parts that no longer matched the new post-war identity. The House of Windsor, newly rebranded from its Germanic origins, could no longer afford visible connections to enemy dynasties. Ernest's royal standing in Britain was erased not with scandal, but with statute. From that point onward, he was persona non grata in British royal circles. His name vanished from court documents. His British affiliations dissolved. The family he had married into, the descendants of Queen Victoria, now treated him as a foreign figure, no longer entitled to the rights and recognition of his marriage alliance. And yet Ernest wasn't embittered, at least not publicly. After the war, he returned to the quiet life of a German nobleman. His principality had lost most of its political clout in the shifting tides of Weimar politics, but he remained a respected figure within aristocratic society. He died in 1950, largely forgotten outside of genealogical charts and dusty archives, a man once at the crossroads of two great empires, ultimately remembered by neither. His story is a subtle reminder that royal status can be both absolute and conditional. You can be royal by blood, by marriage, by title, and still find yourself erased when the political winds change. And that wind didn't stop blowing in 1917. It continued sweeping across royal Europe, knocking titles off shoulders like dust off old portraits. And it didn't spare those with grander dukedoms or deeper Hanoverian roots. The next name on the list was part of a royal house so historically intertwined with Britain, its removal required nothing less than rewriting history itself. 14. Duke of Cumberland and Teviotdale, Ernest Augustus. To lose a title is one thing. To lose a kingdom, a title, and a place in history in a single generation? That's something only a handful of royals have managed. And Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland and Teviotdale, holds that bitter distinction. His name might not leap off the pages of modern royal coverage, but in the early 20th century, his story symbolized the full collapse of a dynastic structure the British crown had spent centuries quietly building. Ernest Augustus was not just any nobleman. He was the head of the House of Hanover, a family that had once ruled both Britain and the German Kingdom of Hanover in a neat, if increasingly awkward, dual monarchy. The connection began in 1714 with George I, who took the British throne while still reigning as Elector of Hanover. But when Queen Victoria inherited the British crown in 1837, Hanover's succession laws blocked her from becoming queen there. They didn't allow female rulers. So the two thrones split. Britain went forward with Victoria. Hanover reverted to her uncle, Ernest Augustus I. The lines diverged, but not entirely. Titles, family connections, and intermarriage ensured that the Hanoverian link remained firmly rooted in the British royal structure. By the time World War I began, the Hanoverian claimant, Ernest Augustus, born in 1887, was both Duke of Brunswick in Germany and, legally, Duke of Cumberland and Teviotdale in Britain. He was styled as a British prince, held British peerages, and was still, technically, entitled to sit in the House of Lords. That dual identity became a problem the moment the war broke out. Like many royals with one foot in each country, Ernest Augustus found himself forced to choose. And he chose Germany. After all, he ruled a German duchy, held rank in the German military, and had deep ties to the German imperial family, including his father-in-law, Kaiser Wilhelm II. There was no plausible deniability. In Britain's eyes, he had crossed the line. The British government acted decisively. Under the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917, King George V struck his cousin Ernest from the list of British peers. The titles Duke of Cumberland and Teviotdale and Earl of Armagh were stripped. So was the style His Royal Highness in the British context. Ernest was now, officially, no longer a British royal. It was a calculated erasure, the legal equivalent of burning a portrait in the palace gallery. What makes Ernest's case especially striking is that it wasn't just a personal demotion. It was a full dynastic cut. His descendants were also excluded from the line of succession. The door wasn't left ajar for a future reconciliation. It was bolted shut. Ernest continued to rule as Duke of Brunswick in Germany, but even that position crumbled shortly after. Following Germany's defeat in 1918, the monarchy was abolished. Ernest abdicated and lost his duchy. In the span of a year, he went from being a double duke with a claim to 2 royal heritages to being a private citizen with a great many enemies and very little power. He spent his remaining years in Germany, maintaining aristocratic dignity where possible, but always as a royal on the margins. Unwanted in Britain and politically neutered in Germany. His descendants, too, lived in this liminal space. Technically noble, historically important, but stripped of legal recognition in the country where their family had once ruled. To this day, the British titles of Cumberland and Teviotdale remain in legal limbo. They were never re-granted, never revived. It's as if the titles were buried with the old order, never to be spoken of again, a ghost in the royal ledger. Ernest Augustus's fall wasn't loud. There were no public accusations, no scandalous headlines. But in a way, that made it more unnerving. The crown didn't need to shame him. It simply deleted him, methodically, quietly, and completely. But while war and politics stripped titles from Ernest, Another kind of removal was already written into the fabric of Britain's monarchy, one that reached even further back, into the aftermath of a royal crisis, so profound it split the kingdom in two. The next royal wasn't removed by Act of Parliament, but by the turning tide of succession itself. A prince turned cardinal, a Stewart loyalist erased by the very throne he once claimed as his own. 15. Henry Benedict Stewart, Cardinal Duke of York. Most royals are erased by politics, a few by scandal, but some vanish because they were simply born on the wrong branch of the family tree, one the monarchy quietly cut off and never replanted. Henry Benedict Stewart, also known by his Jacobite title as Henry IX, and more officially in ecclesiastical circles as Cardinal Duke of York, was the last breath of a royal lineage that Britain tried its hardest to forget. To understand Henry's removal, one must go back to the Glorious Revolution, that bloodless branding reset in 1688 when James II, a Catholic king, was ousted in favor of his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. This wasn't just a dynastic dispute, it was a spiritual schism, one that redefined monarchy as inseparable from Protestant identity, and for the descendants of James II, who became known as the Jacobites, it marked the beginning of a long, painful exile. Henry was born in 1725 in exile in Italy, the younger son of James Francis Edward Stewart, the Old Pretender, who claimed the throne his father had lost. Henry's older brother, Charles Edward Stewart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, would become the face of the last serious Jacobite uprising. But when that rebellion failed at Culloden in 1746, the Jacobite cause withered, and the British establishment turned its back on the entire Stewart line. Henry, unlike his brother, wasn't a soldier. He was a churchman, calm, cerebral, and steeped in Roman Catholic tradition. He entered the clergy at a young age and was made a cardinal at just 22. His rise in the Catholic hierarchy was swift, due not only to his piety, but also his lineage. In the eyes of many continental Catholics, he was royalty in exile, a prince of Britain, regardless of what London said. In 1788, after his brother Charles died without legitimate heirs, Henry became the last living male descendant of the senior Stewart line. Jacobites, few in number by that point, but stubbornly loyal, hailed him as King Henry IX of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He accepted the title privately, even as he continued serving as a cardinal in the Vatican. But in Britain he had no throne, no title, and no legal existence. Parliament had already moved on. The Hanoverians were firmly installed. The Stuarts were relics. Henry's British titles weren't so much revoked as systematically ignored. He was, in theory, Duke of York, a title he used in Catholic and European aristocratic circles. But in Britain, that dukedom had long since been reassigned to Protestant heirs of the reigning monarch. The name Stewart was never spoken in royal circles except as a cautionary tale, a failed brand quietly boxed away. In ceremonial records, Henry didn't exist. And yet, there's a strange irony to Henry's legacy. In his final years, destitute after the Napoleonic invasions wiped out much of his income and holdings, he received a pension, not from sympathetic Catholics or rebellious Scots, but from none other than King George III. The very monarchy that had erased his claim now extended him a quiet gesture of charity. Perhaps guilt, perhaps diplomacy, but certainly not recognition. Henry died in 1807 in Frascati, near Rome. He was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, under a monument funded by George IV, which named him Henry IX, King of England. A contradiction carved in marble, proof that even the winners of history sometimes allow a ghost to speak. His death marked the end of the direct male Stewart line. The Jacobite cause faded into romanticism, immortalized in poetry and song, no longer a political threat, but a wistful what if. Yet the removal of Henry Benedict Stewart from the royal framework wasn't just the result of shifting religious loyalties. It was a strategic forgetting, a conscious effort by the British monarchy to write a cleaner, more manageable narrative, one in which the Stuarts were an unfortunate detour, not a severed dynasty. But the Stuarts were not so easily scrubbed from history. After Henry came others, exiled, forgotten, pushed to the margins. And the next figure in this lineage was no less determined to reclaim the throne that Parliament had promised to someone else. A man raised as a king without a crown, groomed for a destiny that would end not in coronation, but in a long, futile campaign to reverse history. His name would echo through rebellions, royal decrees, and whispered claims to legitimacy, all of which would be ignored by the country he swore was rightfully his. 16. James Francis Edward Stewart, the Old Pretender. History remembers winners as monarchs and losers as pretenders. No royal figure in British history wore that latter label more completely, or more tragically, than James Francis Edward Stewart. Born to rule but raised in exile, titled by blood but erased by law, James was the son of a king and the father of a rebellion, a man whose very existence challenged the political DNA of Britain for over half a century. In the official books, he was nothing. In the minds of his supporters, he was James III of England and the VIII of Scotland. To understand James's removal from royal status is to understand the very architecture of modern British monarchy, built not on pure heredity, but on political convenience, Protestant succession, and a healthy fear of what might happen if a Catholic ever wore the crown again. James was born in 1688 to King James II of England and Mary of Modena. His birth should have been a moment of dynastic triumph, the continuation of a royal line that stretched back centuries. Instead, it sparked a revolution. The issue wasn't James the infant. It was James the potential Catholic monarch. His father, King James II, was already unpopular for his open Catholicism and perceived absolutist tendencies. When his wife gave birth to a male heir, one who would be raised Catholic, Protestant nobles panicked. Within months, they had orchestrated what would become known as the Glorious Revolution. James II was deposed, and his Protestant daughter Mary, along with her husband William of Orange, was invited to take the throne. And so, before James Francis Edward Stewart could even walk, he was already on the outside of history looking in. He was taken to France and raised in the court of Louis XIV at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. There he was treated as royalty in exile, educated as a prince, and raised to believe, fervently, that he was the rightful king of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The French called him Jacques III. The Pope referred to him as the King of England, and his followers back home, the Jacobites, were willing to die for the idea that he had been cheated out of his birthright. But in Britain, James Francis Edward Stewart was not only unrecognized, he was legally erased. In 1701, the Act of Settlement was passed, ensuring that no Catholic could ascend the throne. It named the Electress Sophia of Hanover and her Protestant descendants as the new heirs. James wasn't just skipped over, he was legislated out of history. For decades he tried to change that. In 1715, following the death of Queen Anne and the succession of George I, a German-speaking Protestant prince from Hanover, James launched the first Jacobite uprising. He landed in Scotland with hopes of rallying support and marching on London. But delays, poor coordination, and lukewarm enthusiasm doomed the rebellion. It fizzled out, and James was forced to flee once again to the continent. His attempt at reclaiming the throne earned him the nickname, the Old Pretender, a title laced with irony and scorn. But the erasure continued. While he maintained the style of king in exile, none of his royal British titles were ever recognized again. Parliament branded him a traitor. His supporters were hunted, imprisoned, and executed. And yet, from his various residences in Italy and France, James continued to style himself as the true monarch, signing letters with R for Rex, king, until his death in 1766. He was buried in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, beneath a marble monument that echoed the same unresolved contradiction carved into his legacy. A king without a country, a monarch denied by law but upheld by loyalty. His exclusion wasn't just legal, it was philosophical. The British monarchy was reinventing itself in real time, not as a divine inheritance, but as a Protestant institution, upheld by parliamentary will and national consensus. And James represented the last gasp of an older idea, that birth alone should rule, regardless of belief or politics. But the Jacobite flame didn't die with him. His son, charismatic, doomed, and far more daring, would carry it forward. And his failure, more dramatic and more violent, would finally convince the crown to close the door on the Stewart claim for good. The next royal was not erased quietly. He was erased on the battlefield, but even then his name would live on, in songs, in myths, and in the unresolved ache of a throne that almost was. 17. Bonnie, Prince Charlie, Charles Edward Stewart. Few names in British history shimmer with as much tragic romance as that of Charles Edward Stewart, better known to the world as Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was the heir who nearly seized the throne, the royal who came closer than any other Jacobite to reclaiming the crown for the exiled House of Stewart. And yet, in the eyes of the British monarchy, he was not a prince at all. Officially, he never had a title to lose, because officially, he never existed. But tell that to the thousands who followed him into battle. Born in Rome in 1720, Charles Edward Stewart was the eldest son of James Francis Edward Stewart, the Old Pretender, and the grandson of the deposed King James II. Like his father, Charles was raised in exile, surrounded by reminders of a Britain that no longer recognized him. Yet unlike his father, who had been contemplative and cautious, Charles was charismatic, bold, and utterly convinced that destiny and divine right would place him back on the throne of Britain. From his earliest years, Charles believed what everyone in his circle told him, that he was the rightful Prince of Wales, that the British crown had been stolen from his family, that he was born not just to reclaim it, but to be celebrated for doing so. He had the looks of a prince, the bearing of a monarch, and fatally, the certainty of a man who had never been told no. In 1745, he acted on it. Landing in Scotland with a handful of men and a boat full of hope, Charles launched what would become known as the 45 Rebellion. He rallied the Highland clans with speeches, charm, and promises of restored honor. And remarkably, it worked, at least for a time. His army took Edinburgh. They marched into England, reaching as far south as Derby, causing panic in London. For a few tense weeks, it looked like Britain might be ruled by a Stewart again. But wars aren't won on charisma alone. Without French support and outnumbered by British forces loyal to King George II, Charles's campaign began to unravel. He retreated to Scotland, where, on April 16, 1746, at Culloden Moor, his army was decisively defeated. It was the last pitched battle fought on British soil. It was also the moment Charles Edward Stewart's dream died. What followed was less a fall from grace than a total collapse. The British government labeled him a traitor. His name was added to lists of enemies of the state. He fled the country, spending months evading capture in the Highlands. A fugitive prince disguised as a peasant, hidden by loyal supporters, immortalized in songs and myths that would long outlive him. But none of that changed the fact Charles was never legally acknowledged as a prince by the British crown. From their perspective, he was Charles Edward Stewart, a common man claiming false titles, a would-be usurper, a rebel without legitimacy. His royal identity, asserted so boldly on the battlefield, was nullified by parliamentary law and historical revision. He lived the rest of his life in exile, a slow, bitter decline. The man once hailed as Bonnie Prince Charlie became Charles the Disillusioned. He drank too much, fought with his family, alienated allies. He never returned to Britain. He never tried again. When he died in 1788 in Rome, his Jacobite supporters mourned a king. The British monarchy ignored a ghost. There was no reinstatement, no reconciliation, just silence. Yet his story lingers, not because he succeeded, but because he almost did. His very presence shook the throne. And though he was legally nothing, culturally he became everything. The symbol of lost causes, romantic failures, and the haunting idea that a different Britain might have existed if a few thousand men had made a different choice on a muddy battlefield. His erasure from the official royal record wasn't procedural. It was ideological. He was not removed because he violated royal expectations, but because his claim itself had become a threat to the very idea of what the British monarchy had become. Protestant, stable, Parliament approved, and so the Jacobite dream died with him. Or did it? Not everyone believed the royal future should belong to the Hanoverians. Some, even within the official fold, began to question the meaning of royal titles, and who truly deserved them. One prince, born centuries later, would never even live long enough to wear a crown, and yet, even in death, he would face a quiet, symbolic removal. A posthumous shift in honor, meant not to punish him, but to reshape the legacy of the monarchy itself. 18. Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, son of James I. Every dynasty has its what if, the glittering heir whose early death reshapes the fate of a kingdom. For the House of Stewart, that figure was Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, the firstborn son of King James VI of Scotland and I of England. Born in 1594 into the rising sun of a newly unified British monarchy, Henry was not only the promise of future stability, but the living embodiment of Protestant strength in a country still haunted by religious divisions. His titles were numerous: Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester, the full kit that came with being the next in line to the thrones of England and Scotland. But what makes Henry's story remarkable and unsettling is that despite being the crown jewel of early Stuart rule, his legacy was quietly downgraded, reshaped, and subtly removed from ceremonial memory after his death. Not because of scandal, not because of treason, but because he didn't live long enough to protect his own myth. Henry was everything his dynasty needed him to be: athletic, intelligent, devoutly Protestant, and politically alert far beyond his years. Contemporary accounts painted him as a young man of action, more interested in governance than courtly games, more principled than his father, and, crucially, far more admired than his younger brother Charles. He was seen as England's best hope to avoid the internal chaos that had plagued it for decades. In short, he was the perfect prince. So perfect, in fact, that the court and Parliament began pinning all their hopes on him, long before his crown was due. And then, at the age of just 18, Henry died. Suddenly, mysteriously, and without warning. The official cause was typhoid fever, but the shock of his death rippled far beyond the court's medical reports. Public mourning was widespread. Commoners wept in the streets. Poets eulogized him as the fallen savior of the realm. England had lost more than a future king. It had lost a symbol. But time and politics are rarely sentimental. With Henry gone, his younger brother Charles, quieter, less charismatic, and seen as politically uncertain, became the new heir. And when James I died in 1625, Charles ascended the throne. The same Charles who would dissolve Parliament, bungle wars, provoke rebellion, and ultimately be tried and executed by his own subjects. The monarchy fell. A republic was declared, and for a brief moment, it looked as if the very concept of royal succession had been permanently broken. In this new environment, Henry's memory became problematic. Why? Because remembering him too vividly highlighted just how much the Stuart dynasty had lost. The more noble Henry looked in hindsight, the worse Charles appeared in comparison. So slowly, subtly, Henry was demoted, not stripped of titles officially, but erased from ceremonial importance. His honors, granted with such fanfare in his lifetime, were not maintained in the public consciousness. His heraldry was removed from prominent royal spaces. Successive reigns rarely mentioned him. Even court painters who had once flattered his image shifted their focus to posthumous glorification of the reigning monarch. There was no formal revocation, no parliamentary act. But in the ceremonial memory of the monarchy, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, became a footnote, a might-have-been whose existence was too awkward for the narrative the crown needed to tell. Ironically, his very virtue made him politically inconvenient. By being so much better than his successors, he became an implicit critique of the ones who followed. So the court did what it often does when faced with a contradiction it can't explain. It quietly stepped over him. His name faded from royal liturgies. His titles were redistributed without reflection, and his story was buried beneath the rubble of civil war, regicide, and restoration. But ghosts don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. Henry's memory remained in the minds of those who saw in him not just a prince, but the road not taken, the alternate future Britain might have had. And while Henry was symbolically brushed aside, another royal in the modern age would face something more tangible: the public and institutional removal of a title she once wore with global recognition. Her face had adorned magazine covers, her wedding had stopped traffic, and her name had become synonymous with royalty itself. But in the end, not even the world's most beloved princess was immune to the cold mechanics of title stripping. 19. Lady Diana Spencer, Princess of Wales. In the 1980s, there were few names more powerful, more adored, or more globally magnetic than Diana, Princess of Wales. She wasn't born a royal, but once she stepped into the spotlight, the entire monarchy seemed to tilt in her direction. For a time, the fairy tale held. She was the shimmering symbol of a modern princess, radiant, relatable, and seemingly destined for the crown. But behind the velvet curtain, the story unfolded quite differently, and in the end, the titles she had earned by marriage were stripped from her with the quiet, brutal efficiency that only a centuries-old institution like the British monarchy could administer. Diana Frances Spencer was no commoner. She came from an aristocratic lineage almost as old as the crown itself. The Spencer family were prominent members of the English nobility, with deep historical ties to the royal family. But in royal terms, she was an outsider. When she married Prince Charles in 1981, she was just 20 years old, largely unprepared for the institution she was about to enter, and thrust headfirst into a world built on protocol, scrutiny, and emotional distance. Upon her marriage, she was granted the title Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales, a designation both glamorous and legally significant. The HRH style gave her precedence at state occasions, positioned her as a senior member of the royal family, and ensured that she would be addressed with all the formality due to a future queen. But, more importantly, it symbolized full inclusion. She wasn't just married in, she was woven into the fabric of monarchy. And for a while, the public adored her in that role. Diana brought emotional intelligence to a palace that had long operated on duty alone. She hugged AIDS patients. She walked through landmine fields. She sat on the floor with sick children. These were not photo ops. They were political acts of empathy, and they changed how the world saw the royal family. She wasn't just the people's princess by accident, she earned it. But within the palace, her impact was more complicated. Her marriage to Prince Charles deteriorated quickly. Infidelity, emotional isolation, and incompatible worldviews led to a highly publicized breakdown. By the early 1990s, the fairy tale had curdled into a Cold War. Their separation was announced in 1992, their divorce finalized in 1996, and with it came a quiet but deeply symbolic act. Diana was stripped of the style, Her Royal Highness. She remained Diana, Princess of Wales, a title associated with her former marriage, but no longer carried the HRH prefix. The woman who had once stood second only to the Queen in precedence now had to curtsy to her own sons. The monarchy, for all its pomp and ritual, had spoken. Diana was out. The official reason was procedural. Once divorced from the heir to the throne, she no longer qualified for royal status. But this wasn't about etiquette. It was about power and distance. Removing the HRH style was a clear signal that Diana, beloved by the public though she remained, was no longer part of the royal machine. It was a boundary drawn in ink and silence. The Queen reportedly offered to let Diana retain the HRH, but it was Charles who insisted it be removed. Whether out of protocol or pride, the result was the same. A globally adored figure was formally, if politely, exiled from the core of the royal family. And yet, despite this removal, Diana's influence only grew. Freed from royal obligation, she became even more powerful. Her style evolved, her activism deepened, and her public standing soared. The palace had stripped her of titles, but not of relevance. In many ways, her removal made her even more iconic. A reminder that in the public's eyes, authenticity matters more than aristocracy. Still, the act of removing her title cast a long shadow. It revealed how the monarchy polices its boundaries, even at the cost of public goodwill. And it set a precedent, one that would come into play decades later when another high-profile woman married into the royal family and found herself at the sharp end of history repeating itself. But before that chapter could unfold, there was another woman, another divorce, and another title stripped. Like Diana, she married a prince. Like Diana, she divorced one. But unlike Diana, her departure was not watched by billions. It played out in tabloid ink, scandal, and a royal shrug. 20. Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York. If royal titles are medals of service, then Sarah Ferguson's were quietly revoked in exchange for discretion. She didn't lead armies, or spark constitutional crises, or appear on the steps of Parliament. She simply married into the House of Windsor, lived in its shadow for a turbulent decade, and then was politely shown the side door. No parade, no speech, just a subtle reshuffling of nameplates and a few lines trimmed from the court circular. Sarah Ferguson, or Fergie, as the press christened her, married Prince Andrew, Duke of York, in 1986. At first, the match was celebrated. She was energetic, red-haired, brash in a way that the monarchy seemed to need after the porcelain perfection of Princess Diana. Tabloids adored her. She brought a burst of color to a grayscale institution. For a brief moment, the monarchy seemed capable of modern charm. Upon marriage, she became Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. The title came with all the ceremonial honors of being married to the Queen's second son, precedence, prestige, and the weight of expectation. But the fairy tale proved fragile. Andrew was often away on naval assignments. The distance between them wasn't just geographic. The pressures of public life, media intrusion, and starkly different personalities began to erode the relationship. By the early 1990s, things had come undone. Separation was announced in 1992. The divorce was finalized in 1996, and as with Diana's exit from the royal fold that same year, the HRH was quietly taken back. Sarah lost the style of Her Royal Highness. From that point forward, she would be known simply as Sarah, Duchess of York, a title retained as a divorced peeress, not a working royal. In royal language, this was a clear message. She was no longer considered a formal member of the royal family. Her name would not appear beside the Queen's in official programs. She would no longer represent the crown in public duties. Her removal was not personal, but structural, an administrative conclusion to a marriage that no longer fit the narrative. Yet Sarah's story didn't end there. Unlike Diana, who remained a cultural icon until her untimely death, Sarah became something else entirely. A kind of royal adjacent, hovering in the royal periphery for decades. She never remarried. She continued to live in Royal Lodge, the home she shared with Andrew long after the divorce. They co-parented their children, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, with apparent harmony. Their continued closeness fueled decades of speculation, but no formal reunion ever came. Instead, Sarah remained in a curious royal twilight. She attended some family events, but not others. She was photographed at Windsor but excluded from state banquets. She gave interviews, too many for the palace's liking. She wrote children's books. She dabbled in product endorsements. She became, for better or worse, the first royal ex-wife to try living in the spotlight without a formal script. The palace never formally censured her. They didn't need to. Her removal from HRH status had done the job. It made clear that while she was still family by bloodline, through her children, she no longer represented the institution. She was neither insider nor exile, a royal ghost in a familiar dress. Yet Sarah's presence remains a contradiction the monarchy never resolved. She has made financial headlines, tabloid appearances, and even reconciliations with members of the royal family, including Queen Elizabeth II, with whom she reportedly maintained a warm relationship in later years. But none of that changed the official line. Her title was honorary, not active. Her rank was historical, not operational. The removal of her HRH status may have seemed like a formality, but it was a structural exile. It told every future duchess exactly where the line was drawn. You can marry in, you can leave, but once you're out, you don't come back. At least not fully. And yet, the monarchy would soon face a new kind of royal departure, one not shaped by scandal, but by choice. A couple who didn't wait for the crown to revoke their titles. They stepped back before they could be pushed. And in doing so, they triggered the most public, most polarized, and most debated royal removal in modern memory. 21. Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex. If Diana and Sarah were ushered to the royal exit quietly, Meghan Markle found the door herself, and slammed it behind her loud enough to send shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. Her title was never fully stripped, but in every meaningful way, she was removed. Not by decree, but by design. It wasn't a revocation. It was an uncoupling. A royal severance filed under mutual understanding, but underpinned by tension, public fallout, and the cold geometry of institutional preservation. When Meghan Markle married Prince Harry in May 2018, the world watched a new chapter unfold. A biracial American divorced actress marrying into the House of Windsor felt, for a moment, like a cultural evolution. The monarchy, long regarded as aloof, suddenly looked relevant, inclusive even. For a brief time, the headlines called her the modern face of royalty. The Queen bestowed the titles Duke and Duchess of Sussex upon Harry and Meghan on their wedding day. Meghan became Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex, a style that denoted full inclusion within the senior working royals, the firm as it's known within palace walls. But the honeymoon, institutionally speaking, lasted mere minutes. The trouble began almost immediately. Media scrutiny turned vicious. Tabloid coverage of Meghan was invasive, often cruel, and frequently laced with racial undertones. Within the palace, the invisible machinery of royal life began to close in. Rigid protocols, unspoken expectations, a communications office that often seemed to defend everyone except her. By early 2020, the Sussexes had had enough. In an unprecedented move, Harry and Meghan announced they would step back from their roles as senior royals, a decision reportedly made without consulting the Queen. The palace scrambled, meetings were held, statements were drafted, and after days of speculation, Buckingham Palace issued a careful, almost antiseptic announcement. Harry and Meghan would no longer use the style of His/Her Royal Highness, though they would retain the Duke and Duchess titles. They would no longer represent the Queen. They would repay the money spent on Frogmore Cottage renovations, and they would begin a period of transition. Translation: their titles stayed on paper, but their royal function, and royal standing, had been effectively suspended. The removal of the HRH style was not a legal necessity. It was symbolic. Unlike Sarah Ferguson or Diana, Meghan had not divorced into scandal or been caught in controversy of her own making. She and Harry had chosen to step back. But the monarchy still needed to draw a line. to show the public and the press that this wasn't a casual sabbatical. It was a boundary, and once that line was drawn, the institution distanced itself with quiet finality. Meghan, now simply Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, without the HRH, moved to North America with Harry and their son Archie. They later welcomed a daughter, Lilibet. The family settled in California, signed media deals, launched a foundation, and began telling their version of the story, one that included allegations of institutional neglect, racism, and personal betrayal. In interviews, including the explosive 2021 sit-down with Oprah Winfrey, Meghan detailed the pressure and isolation she experienced within royal life. She did not attack the Queen personally, but the institution she left behind was not spared. That interview marked a final severance. Whatever hope remained for reconciliation, at least on a public level, was gone. Meghan's removal from royal function was now complete, even if the titles technically remained. There were no balcony appearances, no royal tours, no invitations to key events unless filtered through layers of diplomacy. In public life, the Duchess title remains attached to her name, but with an asterisk, a title unmoored from the duties it once represented. To supporters, she is a woman who chose her sanity over ceremony. To critics, she is a duchess who wanted the brand but not the burden. To the monarchy, she is a risk best managed at a distance. And yet, she was not removed alone. Her husband followed. His royal blood couldn't protect him from the consequences of their joint decision. And while Meghan was born outside the system, Prince Harry was born into its marrow. His removal would strike even closer to the core. A prince of the realm, second son of a future king choosing exile over duty. His title wouldn't vanish, but his status would never be the same. 22. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. For most of his life, Prince Harry was defined by proximity to the throne, to the cameras, to duty, to tragedy. He was the spare, the fallback, the cheerful counterbalance to his older brother's destiny, and for years he wore that role like a comfortable if slightly rumpled suit, never quite tailored for kingship, but always close enough to the crown to matter. Then, one day he stepped away, and in doing so, he became something far more complicated, a royal who chose removal. Born Henry Charles Albert David in 1984, Prince Harry was the second son of then Prince Charles and Diana, Princess of Wales. He was royal from his first breath, his name immediately woven into the line of succession. His title, His Royal Highness Prince Harry of Wales, conferred without question. His life unfolded in the public eye, from the solemn image of him walking behind his mother's coffin at age 12, to his military service in Afghanistan, to the tabloid-fueled missteps of a young man growing up under a spotlight too bright for personal mistakes. But for all his public persona, Harry always seemed most himself in motion. In uniform, on tour, launching charitable initiatives like the Invictus Games, connecting with veterans and children alike. He was the royal who hugged people, who laughed too loud, who wasn't afraid to look unpolished. For many, he was the monarchy's most relatable face. Everything changed in 2018 when he married Meghan Markle. The wedding was a global event, a brief illusion of modern monarchy meeting a more inclusive future. On that day, Queen Elizabeth II granted him the title Duke of Sussex, and Meghan became Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Sussex. The couple was, at least on paper, firmly within the fold, but behind palace walls cracks had already begun to form. The press turned on Meghan with a speed and intensity that echoed, and in some ways amplified, the scrutiny Diana once faced. Harry, already haunted by his mother's treatment at the hands of both the media and the institution, reacted decisively. He withdrew. From the cameras, from the firm, from the crown itself. In January 2020, Harry and Meghan announced they would step back as senior members of the royal family. The announcement caught Buckingham Palace off guard. Talks were hastily arranged, and in the end a compromise was reached. One with all the hallmarks of royal diplomacy, politely worded, carefully framed, and cold beneath the surface. Prince Harry and Meghan would no longer carry out royal duties. They would no longer use the style His/Her Royal Highness. They would retain their Duke and Duchess titles, but their connection to the crown, operationally, institutionally, was severed. Harry also lost his military patronages, including honorary roles he deeply valued. These were not just ceremonial uniforms to him. They were symbols of real service, hard-earned respect, and personal pride. Having them removed was, by his own admission, one of the most painful consequences of his decision. Technically, Harry was not stripped of his title, but his HRH status was effectively shelved. In legal terms, it was still part of his name. In practice, it vanished from use. He became, in public and press, simply Prince Harry, or the Duke of Sussex. A man defined not by what he inherited, but by what he chose to leave behind. And yet, he didn't disappear. Far from it. He and Meghan relocated to California. They launched media ventures, signed global deals, founded a charitable foundation, and, perhaps most controversially, began speaking, openly, about what they experienced inside the royal machine. Their interview with Oprah was a seismic moment, emotional, pointed, and, for the monarchy, deeply uncomfortable. Through it all, Harry has remained a prince by blood, a duke by title, and a royal by narrative. But his formal role, the salutes, the balcony appearances, the polished speeches on behalf of Queen and country, is gone. His removal wasn't punitive. It was elective. But the result was the same. A man born to serve the crown now serves something else entirely. He was once the boy walking behind the coffin of a princess. Now he's the man walking away from a palace. Still, even Harry's departure didn't mark the most unusual royal removal. That distinction belongs to a 19th century duke, a man whose love life caused enough constitutional discomfort to get him quietly booted from the royal succession altogether. No rebellion, no lawsuits. Just a marriage so inconvenient that the monarchy pretended he no longer counted. 23. Prince George, Duke of Cambridge, 19th century. In the long, stiff ledger of royal history, there are few cases as oddly surgical, and as morally telling, as that of Prince George, Duke of Cambridge. He wasn't stripped of his title precisely. He wasn't cast out in scandal or erased from the line of succession with a blunt act of Parliament. No, his removal came by way of marriage, or rather, the wrong marriage, one that defied royal protocol so thoroughly, the crown responded by pretending it hadn't happened, and in doing so, quietly amputated him from the future of the monarchy. Born in 1819, the same year as his cousin, Queen Victoria, Prince George was the grandson of King George III and the son of Prince Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge. That put him in the heart of the British royal lineage. He held the title of His Royal Highness, served as a senior member of the royal family, and, for most of his life, was considered a respectable, if somewhat headstrong, aristocrat with all the usual military trappings. And he leaned heavily into the military. George was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in 1856, a position he held for nearly 4 decades. His tenure was long, opinionated, and often controversial. He resisted reforms, opposed modernization, and preferred the army run on hierarchy and tradition, much like the royal family itself. But while his professional legacy remains debated, it's his personal life that nudged him out of royal legitimacy. In 1847, George did something royals weren't supposed to do. He married for love. His chosen partner was Sarah Fairbrother, an actress, already the mother of 2 illegitimate children, and decisively not from aristocratic or noble stock. More importantly, she was not approved by the reigning monarch, Queen Victoria. And under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, That made the marriage not just unofficial, but legally void in the eyes of the crown. Of course, George didn't seem to care. He married Sarah in a private ceremony anyway and lived with her as his wife for the rest of her life. She took the name Mrs. Fitzgeorge, not Duchess of Cambridge, not HRH, but a surname that hinted politely at illegitimacy and impropriety. They had 3 children together, all of whom took the Fitzgeorge name, and none of whom were recognized as legitimate royals. They were excluded from the line of succession, denied titles, and functionally erased from the official royal narrative. George's defiance came at a cost. While he retained his dukedom and military appointments, his position within the royal family grew increasingly marginal. He was not removed in dramatic fashion. This was Victorian England, after all, but he was frozen. His children were barred from inheritance. His marriage was never acknowledged. His household became an off-the-books footnote. And while his public appearances continued, the crown made sure his legacy would not echo in future generations. When George died in 1904, the dukedom of Cambridge became extinct. It would not be revived until over a century later in 2011, when it was re-granted to Prince William upon his marriage to Catherine Middleton. The revival was treated as a fresh beginning, not a callback. George's version of the title was quietly excluded from the celebratory press releases. No comparisons were made, no historical connections invoked. He had, after all, disqualified himself by loving the wrong woman. His removal wasn't a single moment. It was death by 1,000 omissions. Titles were kept, but legacies were buried. His descendants would go on to live relatively privileged lives, but outside the palace gates. Not scandalized, not celebrated, just omitted. George's story is a quiet reminder of how the monarchy polices not just titles and succession, but narratives. A prince may serve his country for decades. He may wear the uniform, bow in all the right places, and live by the code of tradition. But if he marries wrong, if he crosses that unspoken line between royal duty and personal choice, the institution knows how to subtract him without saying a word. But sometimes, the subtraction begins at birth. The next royal was never given a title to lose, not because of disgrace, not because of legal issues, but because their parents declined it. In a modern age where monarchy tries to appear more relatable, more human, some titles are not stripped but refused altogether. And what does it say about the crown when it begins removing itself, one generation at a time? 24. Lady Louise Windsor, daughter of Prince Edward. In the hierarchy of royal removals, there are those who are stripped, those who are shamed, and those who simply never step onto the stage in the first place. Lady Louise Windsor falls into that last category, not cast out, not disgraced, but quietly rerouted before the machinery of monarchy could fully claim her. She wasn't born into scandal or rebellion. She was born into choice, her parents, not her own. And that choice marked a subtle but telling shift in how the British royal family now curates itself. Lady Louise Windsor, born in 2003 to Prince Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, then Earl of Wessex, and Sophie Rhys-Jones, could have been a princess. Not hypothetically, literally. According to the 1917 letters patent issued by King George V, all children of the sons of a monarch are entitled to the style His Royal Highness, or Her Royal Highness, and the title of Prince or Princess. That makes Lady Louise, as the daughter of the Queen's youngest son, a princess of the United Kingdom by right. But when she was born, that title was left at the door. Instead, she was styled Lady Louise Windsor, a designation more befitting the daughter of a duke than a granddaughter of a reigning monarch. The decision wasn't imposed by Parliament or forced by scandal. It was made by her parents, who asked, and received, the Queen's consent not to use HRH styling for their children. The titles weren't revoked. They were simply never activated. This was more than a personal preference. It was a strategic demotion wrapped in a modern narrative, one that reflected a growing belief within the royal family that fewer working royals might actually be better, tighter, cleaner, less expensive, more relatable to the average taxpayer. Prince Edward and Sophie, often praised for their steady work and unflashy approach to royal duty, took the logic one step further. If their children were unlikely to ever carry out official engagements, why saddle them with the expectation and intrusion of princely status? It was a quiet revolution, and Louise, whether she liked it or not, became the first true test case. She grew up mostly outside the spotlight. She attended regular schools. She was rarely seen at royal events until her teenage years. The media didn't hound her. The public didn't expect much of her. And that, in the royal context, was a kind of freedom. She was afforded something few of her cousins ever received, a relatively normal childhood. And yet, the title still hovers. By law, she could claim it. On her 18th birthday in 2021, she became legally entitled to choose whether she wanted to start using the style of Princess Louise. When asked, her mother stated it would be her daughter's decision. So far, she's declined. There's no drama, no public pronouncement, just quiet continuation. Lady Louise, as she's always been styled, but her story raises uncomfortable questions for the monarchy. If royalty can be declined by choice, what does that mean for the institution's relevance? If the role of a prince or princess can be voluntarily bypassed, does it make the rest of the royal scaffolding feel more optional than sacred? Lady Louise isn't a rebel. She's not rewriting royal rules. But her existence within the family, title in reserve, functionally untitled, reveals a softer kind of removal. One shaped by practicality, media fatigue, and a monarchy trying to evolve without quite admitting it has to. And yet, not all such removals are elective. Some are formalized at birth, not because of scandal or protocol, but because of a mother's quiet, radical refusal. The next royal wasn't just born without a title. He was born into a new idea of royalty, one that asks, what happens when a child of the crown isn't given a crown-shaped life at all? 25. Peter Phillips, son of Princess Anne. If royal blood were all it took to earn a title, Peter Phillips would have one. The son of Princess Anne, the only daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, Peter is the eldest grandchild of the late monarch, the first of the Queen's descendants to be born into a post-war, post-imperial Britain. In most royal timelines, that would be enough to guarantee a title, a style, a place in the firmament of the crown. But Peter Phillips never held one. He was born royal, and yet not a royal. Because before he ever took his first breath, his mother made a decision that would change his life, and in some ways, signal the quiet recalibration of the modern monarchy. Peter was born in November 1977, the first child of Princess Anne and her then-husband, Captain Mark Phillips. Under the usual rules of the monarchy, as the son of a princess, he would not automatically receive a princely title. But there was still a path. The Queen could have issued a letters patent to grant him one. She had done it before. She could have done it again. But she didn't. And she didn't because Princess Anne didn't ask her to. Anne, the Princess Royal, had always stood slightly apart from the royal script. Known for her hard work, direct manner, and allergy to fuss, she made it clear that she didn't want her children raised as working royals. She declined the offer of titles for Peter, and later, for his sister Zara. In doing so, she effectively removed her own children from the formal apparatus of the monarchy, not out of rebellion, but out of something much more radical: practicality. She knew what royal titles meant. She had lived under their weight her entire life. And she knew, perhaps better than most, that a title without a defined role is just a target for press intrusion, public expectation, and institutional control. Without a specific royal function, Peter would have become a question mark, a prince in name only, with no palace duties, no public role, and no defined future. So Anne gave him the clearest path she could: the path of a private citizen. Peter Phillips grew up with all the proximity of royalty. Sandringham at Christmas, trooping the color, the Queen as grandma, but none of the trappings. He attended Gordonstoun, like his grandfather Prince Philip, then went to Exeter University. He worked in corporate roles, Jaguar, the Royal Bank of Scotland, and sports marketing. He married, divorced, had children, and appeared at royal events only when family duty required. His life has been, and this is almost revolutionary in royal terms, normal. And yet his absence of title is its own kind of presence. Peter is a visual contradiction. He stands on the palace balcony beside titled cousins, but he holds no official rank. He walks behind royal coffins at state funerals, yet he has no HRH, no dukedom, not even an honorary military rank. He's there, but not of it. His story closes this list not with scandal, war, or legal drama, but with a quiet demotion baked into his birth certificate. He is the first royal to be formally untitled by maternal request, a conscious preemptive removal. And perhaps in that, he represents the monarchy's future, less about crowns, more about choices. A soft pruning of the royal tree, one branch at a time. Because in the end, every royal removal on this list, whether by abdication, marriage, rebellion, or simple refusal, reveals the same truth. Titles may be inherited, but they are also managed, negotiated, withheld, and forgotten. Sometimes with ceremony, sometimes with silence, but always with consequences.